The first morning, Thomas officially took control of Aurelius Pay. He walked into the operations center expecting perfection. Instead, he found a man asleep at the most critical desk in the building. The engineer sat surrounded by glowing monitors, filled with scrolling system logs, warning indicators, and live transaction data. His head rested on folded arms beside a half-empty cup of cold coffee. Around him, exhausted employees moved quietly through the dim operations floor, speaking in tense whispers after another long overnight shift. But Thomas noticed only one thing: the man was sleeping. Aurelius Pay was one of the largest financial technology companies in the country. Every minute, billions of dollars in business transactions passed through its infrastructure. Hospitals, banks, shipping companies, and investment firms depended on its systems without interruption. Even a short outage could trigger financial chaos across multiple industries. And on Thomas's very first morning as CEO, someone was asleep in the center of it all. At 30 years old, Thomas had spent his entire career fighting to prove he deserved his position. Although he came from the family that founded the company, many executives still viewed him as inexperienced. Another privileged successor stepping into power without understanding the pressure beneath the surface. Thomas knew exactly what people whispered behind closed doors. Too young, too aggressive, not ready. So when he became CEO, he promised himself one thing: nobody would mistake him for weak. He believed discipline created respect. He believed hesitation destroyed authority. And above all, he believed problems had to be eliminated immediately. He stopped beside the sleeping engineer and read the badge lying near the keyboard. Andrew Foster. Andrew slowly lifted his head, clearly disoriented from exhaustion. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his shirt looked as though he had been wearing it for 2 straight days. Thomas crossed his arms. This company doesn't pay people to sleep while millions of dollars move through these systems. The room instantly fell silent. Several engineers looked away from their screens. Nobody wanted to become involved. Andrew rubbed his face once, trying to fully wake himself. "Sir, you need to listen to me," he said urgently. "There's something happening inside the payment cluster. I've been trying to contain—" "I'm not interested in excuses," Thomas interrupted sharply. A nearby security officer hesitated. Thomas didn't. "Take his access badge. HR will handle the termination paperwork immediately." A heavy silence spread across the floor. Andrew stared at him for a moment. Not angry, not defensive, just deeply alarmed. "If someone restarts the system," Andrew said carefully, "the entire network could collapse." Thomas barely reacted. "I've already made my decision." Slowly, Andrew removed his badge and placed it on the desk. Before leaving, he looked toward a younger engineer standing nearby. "Do not restart it," he warned quietly. Most people assumed he was frustrated about being fired. None of them understood he had just given the most important warning of their lives. Andrew walked out of Aurelius Pay carrying only his laptop in nearly 48 hours of exhaustion. Behind him, the massive payment infrastructure continued operating normally on the surface. But hidden deep inside the company's aging systems, a cyber attack was already waiting to awaken. And the only man who truly understood it had just been fired by the new CEO. Andrew left the operations center without arguing. The elevator doors closed slowly in front of him, while the building behind him continued operating, as if nothing had happened. Employees returned to their screens. Conversations resumed in cautious whispers. And Thomas, standing near the center console, believed he had just sent a powerful message to the company. Discipline mattered, standards mattered, and no employee was above accountability. At least, that was what he told himself. What Thomas did not understand was that the entire payment infrastructure around him was only appearing stable because Andrew had spent the last 48 hours manually holding it together. Hidden beneath the surface of Aurelius Pay's network, temporary security barriers were still running quietly in the background. Custom patches Andrew had written overnight continued redirecting suspicious traffic away from critical systems. Several compromised authentication pathways had been isolated only minutes before he fell asleep from exhaustion. Without those emergency protections, the system would already have been collapsing. But nobody in the room fully understood what Andrew had been doing, not even close. As the morning continued, Thomas moved through executive meetings with controlled confidence. Department heads listened carefully while he outlined his vision for the company's future. "We need stronger operational culture," he said firmly during one briefing. "Too many people here have become comfortable with mediocrity." Some executives nodded immediately, others remained silent. Meanwhile, down in the technical department, the atmosphere felt very different. A few senior engineers stared uneasily at Andrew's now empty workstation. They had seen him working continuously for nearly 2 days. Some had noticed the growing tension in his face overnight. Others had watched him typing emergency commands directly into live systems, while refusing to leave his chair even long enough to eat properly. Nobody had understood the full picture, but they understood enough to feel nervous now that he was gone. One engineer named Daniel finally walked toward Andrew's terminal after the morning meetings ended. The screens were still active, displaying scrolling logs and warning indicators. "Did he leave notes?" another engineer asked quietly. Daniel nodded. Inside Andrew's internal repository folder were dozens of hastily written files. Authentication logs, routing maps, emergency patch instructions, and time-stamped warnings explaining suspicious activity inside the payment network. The documentation was dense and technical, written by someone working under extreme pressure, with no time to simplify anything for other readers. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the notes. "Do not restart the core cluster." Daniel frowned. "What does that even mean?" someone muttered. Before anyone could answer, another problem appeared. Shortly before noon, transaction latency inside one of the processing clusters suddenly increased. Payment requests that normally cleared almost instantly began slowing by several seconds. Queue volume started rising steadily across multiple servers. The operations supervisor studied the metrics carefully. "It's probably memory congestion," he said after a moment. "A restart should clean it up." Normally, that procedure was routine. Simple, safe, standard. But Daniel immediately remembered Andrew's final warning. "Wait," he said carefully. "He specifically told us not to restart anything." The supervisor barely looked up. "He doesn't work here anymore." A few nervous glances passed between the engineers. Then silence. Inside large organizations, hierarchy often replaces instinct. Once authority makes a decision, people stop trusting their own uncertainty. Even intelligent people convince themselves that someone higher up must understand the situation better. So nobody stopped the restart. At exactly 12:47 p.m., the command was executed. For a brief moment, everything appeared normal. Queue delays dropped. System performance stabilized. Several engineers relaxed visibly. Then the authentication network began failing. The first alerts looked small synchronization mismatches between payment sessions and routing services. But within seconds, the errors multiplied rapidly across the infrastructure. Transaction states disappeared. Verification requests froze mid-process. Internal monitoring systems started reporting conflicting data across multiple regions simultaneously. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Oh no. The restart had erased the temporary defensive layers Andrew built during the previous 2 days, and the hidden breach immediately activated. Deep inside the network, unauthorized routing pathways opened automatically. Suspicious outbound connections began redirecting transaction traffic toward external endpoints outside the verified payment system. Engineers rushed between consoles trying to understand what they were seeing. Why are reconciliation services failing? Where is this traffic coming from? Who changed these routing permissions? Nobody had answers, because the person who understood the system best was no longer in the building. Panic spread slowly at first, then all at once. Attempts to reverse the restart failed almost immediately. Rollbacks would not stabilize correctly because Andrew's emergency patches had never been officially integrated into the infrastructure. They existed only as temporary live modifications held together by his own knowledge of the system. And now that knowledge was gone. Red warning indicators flooded the operations floor. One engineer looked toward Daniel with growing fear. "Call Thomas." Minutes later, Thomas stepped back into the operations center for the second time that day. But this time, the room no longer looked controlled. Monitors flashed critical alerts across nearly every station. Engineers moved with the tense urgency of people trying not to panic publicly. Phones from major clients were already ringing non-stop. Thomas stared at the chaos unfolding around him. "What happened?" he demanded. A senior engineer finally turned toward him, pale and exhausted. The answer came quietly. Andrew was the only thing keeping this system alive. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Around him, the operations center had transformed into controlled chaos. Engineers moved rapidly between consoles, while warning alerts continued spreading across the network faster than anyone could contain them. Entire transaction queues were freezing mid-process. Authentication services were failing across multiple regions. And the deeper the team investigated, the clearer one terrifying fact became. Andrew had predicted all of this. Exactly. Thomas walked toward the main console where Daniel was desperately scanning through Andrew's emergency documentation. "Tell me you can stop this," Thomas said sharply. Nobody answered immediately. That silence frightened him more than the alarms. One senior engineer finally spoke without looking away from his monitor. "We don't fully understand his patch structure," he admitted. Andrew built most of these protections manually, while the system was live. Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the engineer said carefully, "the infrastructure isn't functioning the way the official architecture diagrams say it is anymore." Andrew was compensating for weaknesses nobody else even knew existed. Another alert flashed red across the nearest screen. Unauthorized routing escalation detected. A second later, several transaction servers stopped responding completely. Daniel swallowed hard. The breach is spreading deeper into the payment core. For the first time that morning, Thomas felt genuine fear rising beneath his composure. Not fear for his reputation, not fear of the board. Fear that the company itself might actually collapse. He looked across the room at the exhausted engineers, trying desperately to stabilize systems they no longer fully understood. Most of them were highly skilled. Some had worked at Aurelius Pay for years, but none of them were Andrew. And suddenly, Thomas realized something painful. The quiet engineer he fired that morning had not been just another employee. He had been the foundation holding everything together. Thomas grabbed Andrew's repository notes from the desk and started reading them himself. The files were filled with time-stamped warnings, emergency traffic redirects, temporary authentication barriers, and increasingly urgent instructions written over nearly 48 straight hours without rest. As Thomas continued scrolling, one final message appeared near the bottom of the latest document. If the core cluster is restarted before the dormant trigger is isolated, all temporary containment layers will fail immediately. Underneath that sentence was another line. If I am unavailable, contact me directly before making any system-level changes. A phone number followed beneath it. Thomas stared at the screen. Nobody had called it. Around him, the situation continued deteriorating. Major enterprise clients were already reporting delayed transactions. Internal communication channels overflowed with escalating incident reports. Legal teams had started preparing emergency statements in case the outage became public. And every passing minute increased the possibility of catastrophic financial damage. Thomas slowly lowered himself into the chair beside Andrew's abandoned workstation. For the first time since becoming CEO, certainty disappeared completely. He replayed the morning inside his head. Andrew trying to speak, the exhaustion in his face, the urgency in his voice. And Thomas cutting him off before hearing a single complete explanation. He had been so focused on appearing strong that he never stopped long enough to understand what he was actually looking at. The realization hit harder than he expected. A nearby engineer suddenly turned toward him. "We need Andrew back," she said quietly. Nobody disagreed. Thomas stood immediately. "Call him." Daniel already had the number pulled up. He pressed the call button and waited. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Another engineer tried. Still nothing. Thomas checked the timestamp on Andrew's last repository update. The man had likely been awake for nearly 2 full days before collapsing at his desk that morning. "He may not even hear the phone," Daniel muttered. Thomas made his decision instantly. "Get me his address." Within minutes, HR pulled the emergency contact file from company records. Thomas barely waited for the information before grabbing his keys and heading toward the parking structure himself. Outside, the afternoon sky hung gray above the city as traffic crawled through downtown streets. Thomas drove faster than he normally would have allowed, gripping the steering wheel tightly while replaying the disaster unfolding behind him. Every new alert arriving on his phone made his chest tighten further. Transaction failures increasing, client escalation requests incoming, containment unsuccessful. By the time he reached Andrew's neighborhood, Thomas no longer looked like the confident executive who had walked through Aurelius Pay that morning. He looked like a man realizing the cost of a terrible mistake. The apartment building was small and worn with age, far removed from the polished corporate towers where Thomas spent most of his life. Children's bicycles rested near the entrance. Old wind chimes moved softly beside neighboring doors. Everything about the place felt ordinary. Human. Thomas climbed the stairs and stopped outside apartment 3B. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Louder this time. Several seconds passed before the door slowly opened. A little girl stood there holding a stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. She looked up at Thomas calmly. "Are you looking for my dad?" she asked softly. And in that moment, Thomas realized he knew absolutely nothing about the man he had fired. The little girl held the stuffed rabbit tighter as she looked up at Thomas. "Are you looking for my dad?" she repeated softly. For a moment, Thomas couldn't answer. The crisis at Aurelius Pay was still unfolding in real time. His phone continued vibrating inside his pocket with nonstop emergency alerts from the operations center. Millions of dollars in transactions were hanging in unstable queues. Clients were demanding explanations. Entire sections of the payment network were failing faster than engineers could stabilize them. But standing in front of that apartment door, none of it felt as distant as the simple reality now facing him. Andrew Foster had a daughter, and somehow, nobody at the company, including Thomas, had ever known. The little girl stepped aside slightly. "He's sleeping," she whispered. "Daddy's really tired." Thomas nodded slowly and followed her inside. The apartment was small but warm. Nothing expensive. Nothing designed to impress anyone. A worn backpack rested beside the couch. Children's school papers were neatly stacked near the kitchen table. Half-finished math homework sat open beside a box of crayons. The place looked like a life built carefully, one difficult day at a time. Then Thomas saw Andrew. He was lying on the couch exactly as he had collapsed after returning home. One shoe was still on. His laptop rested half-open beside him, its screen filled with frozen system logs and security alerts. Empty coffee cups and untouched takeout containers sat scattered nearby like evidence of someone who had completely stopped taking care of himself while trying to keep something else alive. Andrew looked less like a careless employee now, and more like a man who had sacrificed everything he had left. Thomas felt a heavy pressure settle into his chest. The little girl lowered her voice again. "He said something bad was happening at work," she explained quietly. "He promised he'd sleep after he fixed it." Those words hit harder than any accusation could have, because suddenly, Thomas understood the full weight of what he had done that morning. He hadn't fired a lazy engineer. He had publicly humiliated the one person silently carrying the survival of the entire company on his shoulders, and he had done it after looking at him for less than 10 seconds. Thomas rubbed a hand across his face, exhausted in a completely different way now. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Chloe. You've been here alone?" She nodded calmly. "Mrs. Harmon from downstairs checks on me sometimes. Daddy said he just needed a little sleep." Thomas glanced back toward Andrew. The man had worked nearly 48 hours without rest, while fighting off a cyber attack large enough to destroy a billion-dollar company. Then he had been fired before he could explain any of it. And despite everything, he still came home worried first about his daughter, not himself. A fresh alert buzzed loudly on Thomas's phone. Critical payment failure escalation. His stomach tightened instantly. There wasn't much time left. Thomas stepped carefully toward the couch. "Andrew," he said quietly. No response. He tried again, slightly louder this time. Andrew shifted weakly but didn't wake fully. Only after the third attempt did his eyes finally open. For several seconds, confusion clouded his expression. Then he recognized Thomas standing in his apartment, and something inside his face hardened. Not anger exactly, but exhaustion beyond disappointment. Andrew slowly pushed himself upright. Thomas spoke immediately. "I was wrong." The words came out faster than he expected. "I should have listened to you this morning." Andrew said nothing. Thomas continued anyway. "They restarted the system. That got his attention instantly. Andrew's expression changed. How bad? Thomas hesitated for half a second. Very bad. Andrew closed his eyes briefly, already understanding more from those two words than most executives in the company understood from hours of technical reports. The containment layers collapsed, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. The breach spread into the payment core. Nobody can stop it. Andrew leaned back against the couch, exhausted beyond measure. For a moment, he simply stared toward the floor while the room remained completely silent, except for the faint hum of his laptop fan. Then Chloe walked over and placed the stuffed rabbit beside him. "Daddy?" Andrew looked at her immediately, his expression softening despite everything. "You okay, Bug?" She nodded. "You should help them." Thomas watched the exchange quietly. Even now, even after being humiliated and dismissed, Andrew's first instinct wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was responsibility, because he understood that if Aurelius Pay collapsed, real people outside the company would suffer for it. Workers waiting on payroll deposits, businesses processing supplier payments, families depending on financial systems staying stable. Andrew finally looked back at Thomas. "I'm not coming back for the job," he said calmly. "Or the apology." Thomas swallowed hard. "I know. I'm coming back because innocent people will get hurt if that system fails." Without another word, Andrew stood slowly and disappeared into the bedroom to change clothes. Thomas remained near the couch, while Chloe hugged the stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. A few minutes later, Andrew returned carrying his laptop bag. The exhaustion in his face remained obvious. But something else had returned too. Focus. As they walked toward the apartment door, Chloe hugged her father tightly before letting go. "Be careful," she whispered. Andrew almost smiled. Then he followed Thomas out into the hallway. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Thomas walked behind Andrew in complete silence, finally understanding who the real leader had been all along. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Do you think Thomas truly deserved a second chance after what he did to Andrew? By the time Andrew and Thomas returned to Aurelius Pay headquarters, the situation had grown even worse. Emergency vehicles from private cybersecurity contractors had begun arriving outside the building. Inside the operations center, tension filled the air so heavily that even quiet conversations sounded sharp. Engineers moved rapidly between workstations while critical alerts continued flashing red across the massive monitoring screens. The moment Andrew stepped through the doors, several employees looked up at once. Relief spread across the room almost instantly. Not celebration, not excitement. Relief, because everyone there understood the same thing now. The only person who truly understood the system had come back. Andrew didn't waste a second. He walked directly toward the primary operations console and dropped his laptop onto the desk beside the existing monitors. His exhaustion was still obvious, but once his eyes locked onto the system metrics, something changed inside him. Focus replaced fatigue almost immediately. "What's the current status of the authentication layer?" he asked. A senior engineer answered quickly. "Outbound routing instability across 3 payment regions. Transaction reconciliation is failing intermittently. We isolated 2 compromised nodes, but we still can't stop the unauthorized redirects." Andrew nodded once. "Who touched the rollback protocols after the restart?" 3 engineers exchanged nervous glances. "We did," one admitted carefully. Andrew didn't criticize them. He simply turned back toward the screens. "Okay, tell me exactly what commands were executed, and in what order." Within seconds, the room shifted around him. People stopped panicking and started organizing. Andrew listened carefully as engineers explained every attempted fix since the system collapse. He interrupted only to clarify details, asking precise questions about routing behavior, transaction timing, and authentication failures. The speed at which he processed the information stunned even experienced staff members. Thomas stood several feet away watching silently. Earlier that morning, he had mistaken Andrew for careless. Now he was watching the entire operations center stabilize simply because one exhausted engineer had returned to the room. Andrew finally leaned back slightly in his chair. "The attackers built their trigger inside the legacy authentication relay," he said calmly. "When the restart cleared my temporary memory protections, It reopened the hidden routing pathway. Several engineers immediately began typing notes. "We need to isolate outbound traffic without shutting down active payment queues," Andrew continued. "If we block everything too aggressively, we'll freeze legitimate transactions and create a second failure." He quickly began assigning tasks. "Daniel, mirror all suspicious outbound connections into an observation environment." Daniel nodded instantly. "Rachel, I need manual verification on every high-value transfer above 7 figures." "Already on it." "Marcus, prepare controlled failover support for the Eastern Processing region. Don't activate unless I say so." The room moved with new purpose. What made Andrew different wasn't just technical skill. It was clarity under pressure. While everyone else reacted emotionally to the crisis, Andrew seemed able to see the entire infrastructure at once, how each failure connected to another, where the real danger was spreading, and which problems mattered most immediately. Thomas noticed something else too. Nobody questioned Andrew, not because of hierarchy, because trust like this could only be earned through years of proven competence. For nearly 90 minutes, the operations center functioned at an intense but controlled pace. One by one, the most dangerous routing pathways were isolated. Compromised authentication permissions were removed. Several suspended transactions were safely redirected before funds could move outside verified systems. Slowly, the red warning indicators began disappearing. Not all at once, but enough. An engineer near the far wall suddenly looked up. The outbound breach channel just collapsed. Another checked her screen. "Authentication sync is stabilizing." Daniel exhaled heavily. "I think we stopped it." Andrew continued monitoring the data for another full minute before finally speaking. "The intrusion path is closed," he confirmed quietly. The attackers lost access. For the first time all afternoon, the operations center became silent. Not fearful silence, relieved silence. Several engineers leaned back into their chairs as adrenaline finally released from their bodies. Others rubbed tired hands across their faces. One employee quietly laughed from pure exhaustion. The company had come dangerously close to disaster, and everyone in the room knew it. Thomas slowly approached Andrew's workstation. "You saved us," he said honestly. Andrew kept his eyes on the monitors. "We were lucky," he answered calmly. "Another 30 minutes, and the attackers could have reached the corporate settlement layer." Thomas felt cold hearing that, because now he fully understood the scale of what almost happened. Billions of dollars, thousands of businesses, potentially irreversible damage, all hanging by a thread he nearly cut himself. An emergency executive meeting was called within the hour. Department heads, cybersecurity leadership, and board representatives gathered inside the main conference room, while incident reports were distributed across the table. This time, nobody interrupted Andrew while he spoke. He explained the intrusion timeline, the hidden trigger mechanism, and the temporary defenses he had spent 2 days building manually inside the live system. He also explained exactly how the restart activated the breach after his dismissal. The room remained extremely quiet. Some executives avoided eye contact completely. Others looked stunned, realizing how close the company had come to collapse without ever understanding the danger. Then Thomas stood slowly from his chair. Earlier that morning, he had spoken with absolute certainty. Now his voice sounded very different. "I made a decision before understanding the situation," he admitted openly. "I judged Andrew based on one moment instead of listening to the person who knew this system better than anyone in this company." Nobody spoke. Thomas looked directly toward Andrew, and because of that mistake, I nearly caused a catastrophe. Andrew met his eyes briefly but said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already understood the truth. The crisis officially ended 3 days later. By then, Aurelius Pay's systems had been fully stabilized. Emergency security audits were already underway, and external investigators confirmed what Andrew had suspected from the beginning. The attack had been highly organized, carefully timed, and designed to exploit weaknesses buried deep inside the company's aging infrastructure. If the breach had succeeded completely, the financial damage would have reached catastrophic levels. But somehow, the company survived, and everyone inside the building knew exactly why. In the days that followed, something unusual happened inside Aurelius Pay. People stopped pretending. Executives who normally hid behind polished corporate language suddenly spoke more honestly in meetings. Engineers who had quietly carried impossible workloads for years began openly discussing the failures buried inside the company's culture. Even department heads who once avoided conflict admitted the same uncomfortable truth. The organization had spent too long rewarding visibility instead of value. Andrew became the center of attention almost overnight. Board members requested private meetings with him. Senior leadership teams suddenly wanted his opinions on infrastructure decisions they had ignored for years. Human Resources prepared an entirely new executive-level position, specifically designed around his expertise. A few weeks earlier, most people in the company barely noticed him walking through the hallways. Now everyone suddenly understood how important he had always been. Andrew handled the attention carefully. He accepted the meetings. He answered the questions. But he never acted triumphant. That surprised Thomas the most. After everything that had happened, Andrew had every reason to be bitter. He could have publicly embarrassed leadership. He could have blamed individuals by name. He could have used the crisis to demand power, money, or revenge. Instead, he focused on something else entirely: prevention. During one board meeting, Thomas watched Andrew place a small folder on the conference table. "These are the conditions I want before I accept any new role," Andrew said calmly. Several executives exchanged cautious looks. Thomas opened the folder first. Inside wasn't a salary demand. It wasn't a title negotiation either. It was a list of structural reforms, mandatory escalation channels, allowing engineers to bypass management during serious security threats, exhaustion protection policies preventing critical staff from working dangerous hours without relief, documentation requirements ensuring no single employee ever became the only person capable of saving essential infrastructure again. The room fell quiet. One board member looked genuinely surprised. "You're asking for policy changes?" he said. Andrew nodded. "We almost lost the company because too many problems were hidden behind hierarchy and assumptions," he replied. "The next person in my position shouldn't have to carry something like that alone." Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. That sentence stayed with him long after the meeting ended, because Andrew wasn't protecting himself anymore. He was protecting people who hadn't even arrived yet. The reforms were approved unanimously, and slowly, Aurelius' pay began changing. Not perfectly, not overnight, but genuinely. Engineers started being included in executive security briefings. Department leaders became more cautious about dismissing concerns from frontline employees. Internal communication shifted from rigid hierarchy toward collaboration in areas where speed and trust mattered most. But the biggest change happened inside Thomas himself. Before the crisis, he believed leadership meant appearing certain at all times. Now he understood something different. Real leadership required listening before judging. Over the following weeks, employees noticed the difference immediately. Thomas still maintained high standards, but he no longer rushed to dominate every room he entered. He asked more questions. He spent time inside departments without cameras or executives following behind him. And when engineers raised concerns, he listened carefully, instead of treating uncertainty like weakness. For the first time since becoming CEO, people began trusting him instead of merely obeying him. One evening near the end of the month, Thomas walked through the lobby after a late meeting and noticed Andrew near the front entrance. Chloe sat beside him on a bench, swinging her legs while explaining something excitedly about school. Andrew listened with complete attention despite clearly being exhausted after another long day. Thomas paused several feet away. It was strange seeing Andrew outside crisis mode. No flashing alarms, no emergency commands, no collapsing infrastructure, just a father listening to his daughter. And somehow, that version of Andrew explained more about him than all the technical reports Thomas had ever read. Chloe suddenly noticed Thomas standing nearby. Her face brightened immediately. "You came back," she said happily. Thomas smiled faintly. "I did." Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the stuffed rabbit Chloe accidentally left behind in the confusion the night Andrew was awakened. "I think this belongs to someone important." Chloe grabbed the rabbit instantly and hugged it tightly. Andrew looked up at Thomas. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The tension that once existed between them had changed into something quieter now. Not friendship exactly. Not complete forgiveness either. Something more complicated. Mutual understanding. Thomas finally broke the silence. "I'm still learning," he admitted honestly. Andrew studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. That usually matters more than pretending you already know everything. Thomas smiled slightly at that, and standing there in the quiet lobby, with the noise of the city fading outside the glass windows, both men understood something the company itself had nearly learned too late. Sometimes the people holding everything together are the ones nobody notices until they're gone. And sometimes the difference between disaster and survival is simply taking the time to listen before it's too late. Weeks passed after the attack, but the story of what happened inside Aurelius Pay never fully disappeared from the building. People still talked about the morning the company nearly collapsed, about the exhausted engineer nobody noticed until it was almost too late, about the CEO who learned the hardest lesson of his career in a single day. But over time, the conversations began changing. The crisis was no longer remembered, only as a disaster narrowly avoided. It became the moment the company itself finally changed. For years, employees at Aurelius Pay had quietly accepted a dangerous culture. People worked themselves beyond exhaustion because they believed being indispensable was the only way to survive. Engineers buried concerns under layers of management approval. Important warnings moved too slowly through corporate hierarchy until urgency disappeared completely. After what happened to Andrew, that culture became impossible to ignore. The new reforms Andrew proposed were implemented across every department. Critical infrastructure teams now operated with mandatory rotation schedules to prevent burnout. Security escalation pathways allowed engineers direct access to leadership during emergencies. Documentation systems were rebuilt so no single employee would ever again carry the entire company's survival alone. And perhaps most importantly, people inside the organization started listening differently. Not just to executives, not just to titles, to each other. Thomas changed too. Before the incident, he believed leadership meant projecting confidence at all times. He thought strong leaders acted quickly, spoke firmly, and never allowed uncertainty to show. Now he understood something far more difficult. Real leadership sometimes meant slowing down long enough to hear the warning someone else was trying to give you. That lesson stayed with him every day afterward. One evening, several months later, Thomas passed through the operations center, long after most executives had gone home. The room was quieter now, calmer than before. Engineers worked steadily beneath the soft glow of monitors, while transaction systems moved normally across the network. Near the center console, Andrew sat reviewing infrastructure reports with Daniel beside him. For a brief moment, Thomas simply watched, not because Andrew was fixing another crisis, but because the room itself felt different around him. Stable, trusted, safe. The company still depended heavily on Andrew's knowledge, but not in the dangerous way it once had. Teams had grown stronger together. Processes had improved. Younger engineers were being trained properly. Information was shared instead of hidden. And Andrew, despite everything that had happened, had stayed. Not because he forgot the humiliation of that first morning, but because he understood something bigger than pride. Sometimes rebuilding matters more than walking away. As Thomas turned to leave, Andrew looked up from his workstation. Their eyes met briefly. No dramatic words were needed anymore. The respect between them had been built the difficult way, through mistakes, accountability, and truth. Outside the glass windows, the city lights stretched endlessly into the night, while Aurelius Pay's systems continued running quietly in the background. Millions of people would never know how close those systems had come to failing. They would never know the name Andrew Foster. They would never see the exhaustion behind the screens. They would never understand how one moment of judgment almost changed thousands of lives. But maybe that was the point. Some of the most important people in the world are not the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones quietly holding everything together while nobody notices. And sometimes, the greatest mistake we make is assuming we understand someone before we've truly listened to them. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment below telling us, have you ever been judged unfairly before someone knew your full story? And if you enjoy emotional stories about hidden sacrifice, leadership, betrayal, and redemption, stay here for the next video. Because the next story might change the way you see people forever.